I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law told me to leave my own son's Mother's Day party, and what surprised everyone later wasn't that I walked out the door, it was what I quietly set in motion afterward. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and until that afternoon I believed I understood my place in my son Daniel's life. The party was held at Daniel's house in suburban Charlotte, a neat two-story place with white siding, blue shutters, and a backyard big enough to fit 3 folding tables, a grill, and nearly 24 guests. The May air was warm, about 75 degrees, the kind of soft spring afternoon that makes people linger outside with lemonade and paper plates. I arrived a little early, the way mothers of my generation tend to do, carrying a homemade apple pie in a glass dish wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel. I had also brought a small gift for Ashley, my daughter-in-law, a silver bracelet I'd found at a local boutique downtown. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, and I had spent several minutes choosing it because I wanted her to feel appreciated. After all, she was the mother of my 2 grandchildren, and Mother's Day should include every woman who carried that role. When I stepped through the backyard gate, I saw Daniel standing by the grill laughing with a couple of his coworkers. My heart lifted a little the way it always did when I saw him, even though he was 36 now and taller than his father had ever been. "Mom, you made it," he said, giving me a quick hug with one arm while flipping a burger with the other. Ashley was near the patio arranging cupcakes on a tray. She glanced in my direction but didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even pause what she was doing. That wasn't entirely unusual. Ashley and I had never been especially close, but I had always told myself that time and patience could smooth most relationships. I placed the pie on the outdoor table beside bowls of potato salad and pasta salad, noticing that someone had written Happy Mother's Day in pink icing across a large cake at the center. Music drifted from a small speaker, something light and cheerful, and the scent of charcoal and barbecue sauce filled the air. Guests chatted, children ran across the grass with plastic cups of soda, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe it was exactly the kind of family gathering I had imagined when Daniel first married Ashley 7 years earlier. But small things began to stand out the longer I stayed. When Ashley introduced guests to each other, she skipped over me entirely, as if I were simply another neighbor passing through the yard. When chairs were arranged around the tables, none seemed meant for me, so I eventually pulled one from the patio myself. I told myself not to take it personally. Maybe she was busy hosting. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe I was imagining things. That's the strange thing about uncomfortable moments in families. You spend more time explaining them away than acknowledging them. Still, I stayed, smiling politely, answering questions from a couple of Daniel's friends about how long I'd lived in North Carolina and whether I liked gardening. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the yard, and the party grew louder as more people arrived. I remember thinking that if the day ended quietly with a slice of pie and a few pictures with my grandchildren, it would be enough for me. I didn't need speeches or recognition. I just wanted to feel like I belonged there. What I didn't know then was that within the next few minutes, in front of everyone gathered in that backyard, Ashley would say something that would change the way I looked at my family forever. I stayed near the table for a while, watching the movement of the party like someone observing a scene that did not quite include them anymore. Daniel moved between the grill and the cooler, laughing with his friends, while Ashley seemed to glide easily from group to group, greeting guests with bright energy that made it clear she was the center of the afternoon. Every now and then she would adjust the decorations or carry a tray of drinks across the yard, and people would thank her for hosting such a lovely Mother's Day gathering. I noticed that each time she spoke about the party, she referred to it as something she had planned completely on her own. I told myself that did not matter. Recognition had never been the reason I showed up for family events. Still, little moments kept piling up in a way that was difficult to ignore. At one point, a woman I had never met before approached me and asked politely, "So how do you know Ashley?" The question caught me off guard for a second, but I smiled and answered calmly that Ashley was married to my son. The woman looked surprised, then quickly nodded and said it was nice to meet me before walking away. I watched her join a group near the patio where Ashley was talking, and for a brief moment I wondered whether Ashley had simply not mentioned that her husband's mother would be there. The thought lingered longer than I expected. I tried to redirect my attention by helping carry a bowl of fruit to the table, but Ashley stepped in front of me before I could set it down. She took the bowl from my hands with a tight smile and said she had already arranged the table the way she wanted it. Her voice was not loud, but there was a sharp edge in the words that made me pause. I stepped back and nodded, telling her that everything looked very nice. The children were playing near the fence by then, chasing each other through the grass with plastic bubble wands, and their laughter drifted across the yard in bright bursts of sound. Daniel walked over for a moment to grab another soda from the cooler beside me. I asked him quietly whether he needed help with anything, but he shook his head and said Ashley had everything under control. There was nothing unkind in his voice, yet there was a distance that had not always been there before. I remembered when Daniel first bought this house 5 years earlier. Back then the backyard had been little more than patchy grass and a crooked wooden deck that needed repairs. I had spent an entire weekend helping him plant the small maple tree that now stood near the fence. It was taller than the roofline now, its leaves moving gently in the warm breeze, and seeing it there brought back memories of a time when Daniel still called me for advice about things like mortgages, insurance policies, and property taxes. I had been proud to help him get started in life. Standing there in the middle of the party, I suddenly realized how different the atmosphere felt now. Conversations flowed easily around me, but rarely included me. Guests chatted about vacations, work promotions, and school events while I listened quietly, holding a paper cup of lemonade that had grown warm in my hand. Ashley passed by again carrying a tray of cupcakes decorated with pink frosting and small sugar flowers. Someone complimented the design, and Ashley laughed lightly as she explained how much effort she had put into making the day perfect for the mothers who deserve to be celebrated. The way she emphasized that phrase made something inside me tighten slightly, though I could not yet explain why. I glanced toward Daniel, who was now talking with 2 neighbors near the grill, and I wondered whether he sensed the same shift in the air that I did. The afternoon sun had moved higher by then, bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the yard, and the party seemed to reach its busiest point as more guests gathered near the tables. That was the moment Ashley set down the tray, looked across the yard directly at me, and began walking in my direction with an expression that told me the day was about to change in a way none of the guests were expecting. She stopped about 6 feet in front of me, close enough that I could see the tightness around her smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes. For a second I thought she might simply ask whether I needed anything, perhaps another drink or a seat at the table, the kind of polite exchange people have at family gatherings. Instead she folded her arms lightly and glanced around at the guests nearby as if making sure they could hear her. The conversations around us softened slightly, the way people instinctively grow quiet when they sense something uncomfortable about to happen. Ashley tilted her head and spoke in a tone that sounded almost casual, yet every word carried a sharp clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. She said that this celebration was meant for the mothers who were actively raising children right now, and that perhaps it would be better if I headed home and let the younger families enjoy the afternoon. For a moment I simply stood there holding my paper cup of lemonade, trying to process what she had just said. I could hear the faint hiss of the grill behind me and the distant laughter of the children near the fence, but everything close to us had gone strangely still. One of Daniel's coworkers shifted his weight awkwardly a few feet away, pretending to check his phone while clearly listening. I glanced toward Daniel without turning my head too quickly, expecting him to step in or at least say something that might soften the moment. He looked surprised at first, then uncertain, and finally he lowered his gaze toward the grill as if deciding the burgers required his full attention. That small silence from him felt heavier than Ashley's words. Ashley continued speaking, explaining that she had worked very hard planning the gathering, and that she wanted the atmosphere to stay relaxed and fun for everyone. She said it with the bright, composed voice people use when they believe they are being perfectly reasonable. I remember noticing the breeze lifting the edge of the tablecloth beside us and the faint smell of barbecue sauce drifting through the air. Small details that suddenly seemed strangely vivid as my mind struggled to catch up with the moment. I set the lemonade down on the table so that my hands would be steady and looked at her carefully. I asked whether she was serious. Ashley nodded once and gave a light shrug, as if the decision were obvious. She added that sometimes it was healthier for families when older generations stepped back and allowed new traditions to form. Someone behind her cleared their throat quietly, but no one spoke. I thought about the pie sitting on the table a few feet away, still covered with the towel I had wrapped around the dish before leaving my kitchen that morning. I thought about the bracelet in the small gift box resting beside it, waiting for a moment that now clearly was not coming. Most of all, I thought about how many years I had spent believing that patience and kindness would eventually build a comfortable bridge between Ashley and me. Standing there in that warm backyard with 20 people pretending not to watch, I realized that bridge had never truly existed. I lifted my purse from the back of the chair I had pulled earlier and straightened the strap on my shoulder. My voice sounded calm even to my own ears when I answered her. I told Ashley that if she truly wanted me to leave, I would respect her request. I did not raise my voice and I did not argue. I simply nodded once, the way someone might conclude a brief conversation with a neighbor. A few guests looked relieved that there was no scene, though their expressions still carried the uneasy awareness that they had witnessed something deeply awkward. As I turned toward the gate that led back to the driveway, I caught one more glimpse of Daniel near the grill. For a fraction of a second it looked like he might step forward, but he remained where he was. The gravel in the driveway crunched softly under my shoes as I walked to my car, and while the afternoon sun still felt warm on my shoulders, the quiet decision forming in my mind was far colder than anything anyone at that party could have imagined. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, both hands resting quietly on the steering wheel, while the sounds of the party continued faintly behind me. Through the windshield I could see the maple tree Daniel and I had planted years earlier rising above the fence line, its branches moving gently in the warm afternoon breeze. The house looked exactly the same as it always had from the street, neat and welcoming, with the small American flag beside the front porch and the flower beds I had once helped Daniel clear when he first moved in. Anyone driving past would have assumed a joyful family celebration was happening in the backyard. For a few seconds I considered simply driving away without thinking about any of it, but the silence inside the car gave my thoughts room to settle. I remembered the morning Daniel called me 5 years earlier when he and Ashley were struggling to finalize the purchase of that house. Interest rates had risen unexpectedly, and their savings were not quite enough for the down payment the bank required. Daniel had sounded embarrassed on the phone that day, explaining the situation carefully as if he hated to ask for help. I had listened quietly at my kitchen table while he described the problem, and when he finished I told him that families help each other when it matters. Within 2 weeks I transferred $120,000 from the savings account his father and I had built over decades. It was not money I parted with lightly, but I believed in giving my son a stable start. When we met at the attorney's office to finalize the paperwork, the lawyer had reviewed the documents slowly and suggested that my name remain on the property title alongside Daniel's, at least until the financial arrangement between us was settled. I remember Daniel waving a hand casually, and saying it did not really matter because we trusted each other completely. I had smiled and agreed that trust was important, yet I allowed the attorney to include my name anyway, simply because he insisted it was the sensible thing to do. Over time the detail faded into the background of daily life. Daniel and Ashley moved in, renovated the kitchen, and hosted holidays that gradually became traditions. I never brought up the paperwork because I never imagined I would need to. Sitting there in my car that afternoon, however, the memory returned with surprising clarity. I could almost see the attorney sliding the documents across the polished desk, and hear the quiet scratch of the pen when I signed beside Daniel's name. The realization did not arrive like anger or revenge. It came more like a calm piece of information finally settling into place after years of being forgotten. Ashley had told me it might be healthier for the older generation to step back and allow new traditions to form. I considered her words carefully while the engine of my car hummed softly in the driveway. Perhaps she was right about one thing. Sometimes stepping back simply means removing yourself from places where you are no longer welcome. I started the car and pulled slowly onto the quiet suburban street lined with identical mailboxes and trimmed lawns. The afternoon traffic was light, and as I drove the familiar route toward my small townhouse on the other side of town, the events of the party began to feel strangely distant. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a simple request delivered in front of a crowd and a quiet decision to honor it. Yet the more I replayed Ashley's words in my mind, the more certain I became that leaving the party was only the first step. By the time I turned into my driveway and switched off the engine, another decision had already taken shape in my thoughts. It was not impulsive and it was not emotional. It was practical, calm, and based on a detail Daniel and Ashley had apparently forgotten entirely. As I stepped out of the car and walked toward my front door, I realized that the next conversation I needed to have would not be with my son or my daughter-in-law at all. It would be with the attorney who had insisted years earlier that my name remain exactly where it was on those documents. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully brightened the quiet street outside my townhouse. For a few moments I simply sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee warming my hands, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a delivery truck moving through the neighborhood. The events from the afternoon before returned to my mind slowly, not as a burst of anger but as a series of clear images that felt almost strangely calm now. Ashley standing in the backyard with her arms folded. The silence from the guests. Daniel looking down at the grill instead of meeting my eyes. I had spent most of my life believing that patience and understanding were the strongest tools for holding a family together. But sometimes clarity arrives when you realize that patience has been mistaken for weakness. After finishing my coffee, I walked into the small study near the front window where I kept several file boxes neatly organized along the wall. Years of careful habits had taught me to keep important documents in one place, labeled and dated. It only took a few minutes to find the folder from 5 years earlier containing the closing paperwork from the purchase of Daniel's house. I placed the folder on my desk and opened it slowly, sliding the documents out one by one. There it was exactly as I remembered. A stack of papers with the official county seal stamped across the top page, and both of our signatures clearly printed beneath the property description. My name appeared beside Daniel's in black ink, confirming joint ownership of the home. The lawyer had explained the arrangement at the time in very simple terms. Until the financial agreement between Daniel and me was settled, the property legally belonged to both of us. It had never been a secret. It had simply never mattered before. I leaned back in the chair and read through the pages carefully, reminding myself of every detail. The amount I had contributed was clearly documented, along with the structure of the agreement and the legal protections attached to it. Nothing about the paperwork had changed in the years since we signed it. The house in that cheerful suburban neighborhood was not solely Daniel and Ashley's home the way they appeared to believe. It was still partially mine as well. Around 9 o'clock that morning I picked up the phone and dialed the office of the attorney who had handled the closing. The receptionist recognized my name immediately and placed me on a brief hold before transferring the call. When the attorney came on the line, his voice sounded pleasantly surprised to hear from me after so many years. I explained calmly that I wanted to review the current status of the property agreement and understand what options existed if one owner wished to separate their share from the arrangement. He listened carefully without interrupting, then asked a few practical questions about the original contract. There was nothing dramatic about the conversation. It sounded more like a routine financial discussion than anything else. After checking the records on his computer, he explained that my ownership was still legally active, and that I had several options available depending on what outcome I wanted. One option involved requesting repayment for my original contribution, along with the appreciation in property value over the past 5 years. Another option involved initiating a formal process that would require the property to be sold, if an agreement between the owners could not be reached. I thanked him for outlining everything so clearly, and asked him to prepare the necessary documents so I could review them in person later that week. When I hung up the phone, I felt the same steady calm that had settled over me the afternoon before. Ashley had told me it might be healthier for the older generation to step back and allow new traditions to take shape. In a quiet way, I had decided to do exactly that. The difference was that stepping back sometimes means reminding people of the foundation they are standing on, especially when that foundation was built with your own savings, your own signature, and years of quiet support they had long since stopped noticing. 3 days later, I sat across from the attorney, in a quiet office that overlooked a row of oak trees lining the courthouse square. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, the kind of place where decisions tended to be made slowly and carefully. The attorney, Mr. Callahan, had already placed a thin folder on the desk between us before I even sat down. He greeted me warmly and mentioned that he still remembered the closing meeting from 5 years earlier when Daniel purchased the house. I nodded politely and told him that day had been one of the proudest moments of my life as a mother. Helping my son settle into a stable home had felt like the natural continuation of everything his father and I had worked toward for decades. Mr. Callahan opened the folder and reviewed the documents with me again. pointing to the sections that confirmed my financial contribution and my position as a co-owner of the property. Nothing in the paperwork had expired or changed. Legally speaking, the arrangement was exactly the same as the day we signed it. He explained once more that because the home had appreciated significantly in value over the past 5 years, my share of the property now represented a much larger amount than the original $120,000 I had provided. The neighborhood had grown more desirable, new schools had been built nearby, and property prices had climbed steadily. I listened quietly while he outlined the options available. One possibility involved giving Daniel and Ashley a formal opportunity to buy out my share at the current market value. Another possibility involved initiating a legal notice that would require the property to be sold if an agreement could not be reached between the owners. The process sounded complicated on paper, but Mr. Callahan spoke about it with the calm confidence of someone who had handled many similar situations before. I asked him one simple question. If the roles were reversed, and one owner no longer wished to remain financially tied to the property, what would be the most straightforward path forward? He leaned back slightly in his chair and said the most common solution was a formal notice requesting either repayment or a negotiated buyout within a specific time frame. If that request was ignored or rejected, the legal system provided a clear method for resolving the situation through the sale of the property and division of the proceeds. There was nothing emotional about it. It was simply the structure of property law. I looked down at the document he had prepared and read the opening lines carefully. The language was formal but respectful, stating that I wished to review the financial arrangement attached to the property and resolve the ownership structure in a fair and timely way. There were no accusations and no personal remarks. It was a professional request between two parties who shared legal responsibility for the same asset. Mr. Callahan asked whether I wanted to move forward with sending the notice to Daniel. For a moment I thought about the backyard party again, about the quiet sentence Ashley had spoken in front of everyone, and the way Daniel had lowered his eyes instead of responding. I had not raised my voice that afternoon, and I had no intention of doing so now. Calm decisions often carry the greatest weight because they are not driven by impulse. I nodded once and told Mr. Callahan that I believed it was time to resolve the matter properly. He printed the final version of the notice and asked me to review it one last time before signing. The pen felt light in my hand as I wrote my name across the bottom of the page, the same way I had signed years earlier when the house first became part of our lives. The difference now was that this signature was not about helping my son begin a new chapter. It was about quietly closing one that no longer held the same meaning. Mr. Callahan explained that the letter would be delivered by certified mail within the next 48 hours, so there would be no confusion about when it arrived. I thanked him for his help and gathered my purse before leaving the office. As I stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the afternoon sun was warm and the courthouse clock across the street chimed softly. Somewhere across town Daniel and Ashley were likely continuing their ordinary routine, completely unaware that a carefully worded letter was already on its way to their mailbox, carrying a reminder they had not thought about in years. 2 days after the meeting with Mr. Callahan, I was watering the small row of lavender plants outside my townhouse when my phone began to ring inside my purse. The afternoon was quiet and warm, the kind of slow weekday where the neighborhood seemed almost empty except for the occasional sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. I finished pouring the last bit of water into the flower bed before reaching for the phone, already having a quiet suspicion about who might be calling. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For a moment I simply looked at it, while the phone continued vibrating in my hand. My son rarely called during the middle of the workday unless something unusual had happened. I answered calmly and greeted him the same way I always had. His voice on the other end sounded confused at first, almost disoriented, as if he had just read something he could not quite believe. He asked whether I had spoken with an attorney recently. I told him that I had. There was a brief silence before he continued, explaining that a certified letter had arrived at the house that morning addressed to both him and Ashley. The envelope had contained formal documents regarding the property ownership, and a request to review the financial arrangement connected to the house. He sounded as though he expected me to deny it or explain that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, I simply confirmed that the letter had been sent at my request. Daniel exhaled slowly and said he did not understand why this was happening now after so many years. I reminded him gently that the arrangement had always existed exactly the way it was written in those documents. My name had remained on the property the entire time, and the financial contribution I made had never been formally resolved. Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could almost imagine him standing in the kitchen of that house holding the paperwork in his hands while trying to piece together what it meant. He asked whether this had something to do with the party a few days earlier. I told him that the letter was simply about clarifying an old agreement that had been left open for too long. Before he could respond, I heard another voice in the background, sharper and more urgent. "Ashley." Her voice rose quickly as she asked Daniel who he was talking to and whether it was me. A second later the phone shifted and she was speaking directly into the receiver. Her tone carried none of the polite calm she had used in the backyard during the party. She demanded to know why I was suddenly trying to take their house away. I listened without interrupting while she spoke quickly about how unfair the situation was, and how the children needed stability. When she finally paused, I answered in the same steady voice I had used the entire conversation. I explained that the letter did not take anything away from them. It simply asked that the financial agreement connected to the house be addressed properly, either through repayment or through another solution that both parties could accept. Ashley responded immediately that they could not possibly afford to repay the full amount right now, especially with the increase in property values. Her words came out faster and louder with each sentence, but I did not raise my voice in return. Instead, I reminded her of something she had said during the party, a sentence that had stayed with me ever since. She had mentioned that sometimes it was healthier for older generations to step back so new traditions could grow. I told her calmly that I had taken that advice seriously and decided it was time to step back from the financial foundation supporting their home as well. The line went completely silent after that. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Eventually Daniel returned to the phone and said they would need some time to think about what the letter meant. I told him that was perfectly reasonable, and that the attorney had included a clear timeline in the documents so they could review their options. When the call ended, I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked around the quiet street again. Nothing about the neighborhood had changed in those few minutes, yet somewhere across town the letter sitting on Daniel's kitchen counter had already begun reshaping a reality they had not expected to face. The next week moved slowly but quietly, the way time often does when people are waiting for a decision they are not sure how to make. I continued with my usual routines, visiting the local grocery store on Tuesday morning, attending my small church group on Wednesday evening, and spending time tending the plants outside my townhouse. From the outside my life looked exactly the same as it had before the party. Yet, I knew that across town Daniel and Ashley were likely having very different conversations inside the house they believed belonged entirely to them. The certified letter had given them 30 days to respond with a proposed solution. Mr. Callahan had explained that this timeline was standard for matters involving shared property. It allowed both sides to review financial records, consult advisors, and decide whether they wanted to negotiate a buyout or consider other options. For the first several days I heard nothing from them at all. That silence did not surprise me. Situations involving money and property often take time to settle into reality. Then late one afternoon, about 9 days after the letter had arrived, my phone rang again while I was folding laundry in the living room. This time Ashley's name appeared on the screen instead of Daniel's. I answered calmly, placing the folded towel beside me on the couch. Her voice sounded different from the last conversation we had shared. The sharp edge was still there, but it was mixed now with something closer to urgency. She said she had spent the week speaking with a mortgage advisor and reviewing the documents from the attorney. According to the current property values in their neighborhood, my share of the house had grown significantly since the original purchase. The amount required to buy out my portion was now far larger than the $120,000 I had contributed years earlier. She said the number was simply impossible for them to produce in such a short time. I listened quietly and let her finish explaining everything she had learned. When she paused, I asked whether Daniel had also spoken with the attorney listed in the letter. She said he had planned to but had not yet found the time because of work and the children's school schedule. The conversation drifted for a moment into practical details about refinancing and property appraisals, before Ashley finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting in the center of her thoughts all week. She asked whether I would consider withdrawing the request and leaving things the way they were before. I answered slowly and carefully, choosing words that carried no anger but also no uncertainty. I told her the letter was not meant to punish anyone or create chaos in their lives. It was meant to resolve a financial agreement that had remained unfinished for too long. Ashley responded quickly that family relationships should not be handled like business transactions. Her voice rose slightly as she spoke, as though the argument itself might change the facts written on those documents. I reminded her gently that the arrangement had been created in a lawyer's office long before the party in their backyard, and long before the conversation we were having now. It had always been both a family decision and a legal one. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had said. After several seconds she asked what would happen if they could not afford to buy my share within the time allowed. I told her exactly what Mr. Callahan had explained to me. If no agreement was reached, the law provided a method for selling the property and dividing the proceeds between the owners. I did not rush the explanation and I did not soften the reality of it either. Ashley inhaled slowly when she heard that answer, the way someone does when a possibility they had been hoping to avoid suddenly becomes real. For the first time since the party I heard a trace of uncertainty in her voice when she spoke again. She said they would need more time to think and discuss everything with Daniel. I told her that was completely reasonable, and that the attorney would remain available if they wished to explore a buyout arrangement. When the call ended I placed the phone on the coffee table, and looked around my quiet living room. Outside the window the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the small yard. Somewhere across town Daniel and Ashley were beginning to understand that stepping back from someone is not always a simple request, especially when the ground beneath your feet was built with their support. The final weeks of that 30-day timeline passed with a quiet steadiness that felt almost reflective. I continued living my normal routine while the situation slowly unfolded across town. There were no dramatic confrontations and no sudden arguments, only the gradual movement of decisions that had been delayed for years. About 3 weeks after the letter arrived, Daniel called again one evening just after sunset. His voice sounded tired but calmer than it had during our previous conversations. He explained that he and Ashley had finally met with a financial advisor and reviewed every possible option available to them. Refinancing the property at the current value would not cover the full amount needed to buy out my share, without placing a heavy strain on their monthly expenses. They had also spoken with a real estate agent who confirmed that homes in their neighborhood had increased significantly in value since the time of the original purchase. Daniel paused for a moment before continuing, as if choosing his words carefully. He said they had come to a difficult conclusion. Rather than stretching themselves into financial pressure they might regret later, they believed it would be wiser to place the house on the market and sell it voluntarily before any legal process required it. Hearing those words did not bring me satisfaction or triumph. Instead it brought a quiet sense of closure that settled gently over the conversation. I told Daniel that I understood the decision, and that selling the property would allow both of us to resolve the ownership in a fair and straightforward way. Over the following weeks the process moved forward exactly as the real estate agent had predicted. The house was listed, several families visited during open house weekends, and within a short time a buyer made an offer that reflected the strong market in their area. When the sale was finalized, the proceeds were divided according to the legal agreement that had existed all along. My portion included the return of my original contribution, along with the increase in value that had accumulated over 5 years. Daniel and Ashley received the remainder and began searching for a smaller home that better fit their finances without relying on anyone else's support. A few days after the closing was completed Daniel visited my townhouse alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking around the living room, the same way he used to when he was younger and had just come home from college for the holidays. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and talked quietly about the changes that had happened over the past month. He admitted that when Ashley asked me to leave the party he had been caught off guard and unsure how to respond in front of everyone. I listened without interrupting and told him that life sometimes teaches lessons in unexpected ways. Families are built on respect just as much as they are built on love, and when respect disappears the foundation begins to shift. Daniel nodded slowly as if he understood more clearly now than he had before. When he left that evening the sky was already dark and the porch light cast a soft glow across the front steps. I watched his car pull away down the quiet street before closing the door behind me. In the weeks that followed, I used part of the money from the sale to take a small trip to the coast, renting a modest cottage for a few days where the ocean breeze moved through the windows and the sound of waves filled the evenings. Sitting on the porch one morning with a cup of coffee in my hands, I thought about how strange it was that everything had started with a simple sentence spoken at a backyard party. Someone had asked me to leave, believing it was a small moment that would disappear by the end of the afternoon. What they had not expected was that sometimes when a person quietly walks away, they take far more with them than anyone realizes.